Like, you can do that? This is giving people actually aspire to these things. It's like the idea of aspiring to what Gary was saying had not crossed my mind until I heard Gary. And so knowing that this is a huge new chapter in Fort Lewis, I wanted to make sure that the people at Fort Lewis can have the same experience that I did when I first heard Gary. The other thing that's amazing about listening to Gary is, how do we put this? He could do like a mind-reading act that's higher education specific. You know, you could say, Gary, tell me about my university. It's a small liberal arts college in the state of this. And Gary will tell you, even though he's never been there. And you could do your act in carnivals all around universities, all over the country, telling people about their colleges, because, as we've already seen today, so many of the things that we're experiencing in our own colleges are happening all over the country, but we don't know about it. And Gary does, which is why I use our keynote for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gary Rhoades.
That's going to be a kind of a hard act to follow, this Gary Rhoades guy. I'm really delighted to be here. It's terrific. Thank you, Jonathan, not just for that introduction, but for the work that you're doing. It's good to be back in Colorado with folks that I know. You've got a tremendous conference. And I would say, very much like what Jonathan said in introducing this meeting this morning, that you have accomplished an incredible amount as a state. And that strength across the state is something that folks at Fort Lewis really are going to benefit from and should feel free to draw upon and learn from. Because for a lot of years, Colorado's been experiencing some very interesting challenges in the area of shared governance and academic freedom. And in terms of contingent faculties, terms and conditions of work, which, as we've heard so dramatically portrayed, characterize the destruction of academic freedom and shared governance through the restructuring of the academic workforce and creating an entire majority cadre of professors who have neither, unless they choose courageously, like the panel that we saw, and particularly the way that you spoke, Miranda, I'm going to act like I have academic freedom, even if supposedly on paper I don't. Unfortunately, there are too many people who on paper have academic freedom and never exercise it, so kudos to you and your colleagues. I'm really delighted to be here as well, because it's not often the case that a chapter emerges so dramatically in terms of size across the country, and so I gather Janine is sick, but to her and her colleagues who I've met here, it's not a small thing to create any sort of a chapter, but to create a chapter of the size and significance that you already have done, and to get the attention of the administration in order to engage them, not just in a conversation, but in a negotiation, is quite an accomplishment for a small group of faculty. So it's not only because it's a beautiful place, but it's really a pleasure to be here. It's always inspiring to hear about what's going on in various campuses around the country. And I think one of the biggest challenges for the local chapter, a couple weeks ago I was speaking to a guy who started the AAUP chapter at Northern Arizona University, Guy Sinise, and as he was saying, the challenge always in building chapters, and Irene can speak to this too, is it's one thing to establish something around a major flashpoint. It's another thing to sustain something, and as part of that sustenance, to, in an iterative way, do the kind of work that Suzanne and Don and so many others in this state have done. So you've got a lot of good models on how to accomplish that within your state and around the country. And I wish you the best of luck in doing that, and I'm always happy to be of whatever assistance I can in doing that. Because these collections of faculty are so important, not just in advancing the principles of the AAUP, but in advancing what's at the core of the AAUP, which Don and others spoke to earlier today, which is that faculty are guardians of the public trust and the public interest, which is fundamentally being compromised by the current direction of colleges and universities in this country. And so if we're going to move and change the direction of American higher education, it's going to have to come through us. And it's that kind of combination of process, shared governance, and purpose. What is our contract? What was the contract that those AAUP creators 100 years ago, almost exactly, upon which they based their claim that they should have shared governance, they should have academic freedom, they should have tenure? It was that they were guardians of the public interest, and that they were shepherds of this institution, trustees of the institutions which employed them, even though we like not to think that we're employees, and we certainly don't want to act like employees in the sense that some people who work in employment want to characterize us. One of the principles of organizing, and I love the caprices I want to go from awfulizing to organizing. One of the challenges in organizing is to overcome just the sense of awfulness, the sense of it's overwhelming, what in the world could be done, and the overriding sense of fear, which Miranda and others spoke to. And it's fear not only among the ranks of non-tenure track faculty, but among the ranks of faculty generally. And that's another reason these chapters and conferences, these kinds of gatherings are so important, is to overcome that sort of fear, and to recognize one of the reasons, principally for becoming a faculty member, is to be able to speak and teach and do the work that you believe in. And if you have to give that up, you may as well not be a faculty. But you can't do that alone. You need to do that in collection and in combination with other colleagues who, in a variety of ways, sustain and inspire you. We've heard that from Tom, from Tim, from basically all the panels about the importance of their colleagues, not just individually, but collectively. So here's what I'm going to try and do today. I'm going to try and map out a sense of how to combine process and purpose. But first I kind of want to do a little map of why we're here. And before that, probably I ought to give you a little more sense of who I am, beyond being someone who can perform in carnivals. So let me change slides here. It worked. So, my comments today, I actually do, when I speak somewhere, I spend a good deal of time trying to figure out a little bit of something about the place. I study colleges and universities. That's the research that I do. I've traveled a lot around this country, but every place has its own story and its own particular local considerations. That's why I said earlier, and I want to kind of emphasize that about my remarks, all strategy is local. Even though you need to think globally and connect globally, you need to deal locally with what you have and who you are and where you are. So the kinds of things that I'm talking about here, if I was at Mesa, if I was at Pueblo, you know this, I would give a different talk. So this talk is really tailored to Fort Lewis, and I'll connect in some ways to some other campuses as well. But that localness, I think, is really important in mobilizing faculty. So what I want to speak to is something, though, that we're all confronted with. And I ran across this in talking with with a faculty group, a chapter, several years ago at Washington State University. And this was a group like yourselves, a very smart, committed faculty. They formed a chapter. They were very concerned about the direction their institution was moving. They were very concerned about shared governance issues. They were deeply concerned about having some sort of voice in the direction of their institution. But there was another concern as well, and that was articulated by one guy who said, can't we just be for something? Like, we are so often in the position of saying, this is rotten, no, this is no good, no, because the initiatives come so fast and furious. I'm gonna say, I know from emails that you've gone through 2 or 3 in the last 8 years, gen ed curriculum revisions at Fort Lewis College. If you're like any college or university in the country, you've had at least 2 or 3 iterations of strategic plans, usually coming with each new chief executive officer, each new president. And we're constantly in the place of saying, no. We're in that prevention place that Tim was talking about. We've got to prevent these folks from doing their worst. Because we were here before they came, and we're going to be here after they leave, and we're going to have to clean the mess up. But what this guy was articulating was, it's important to also be able to take initiatives and put forward proposals proactively for where you want your institution to go. Either generally or with regard to specific issues, like with technology. So, a wonderful presentation by Jonathan, I thought, on IT. So many decisions being made, we can hardly keep up with which LMS, which new instructional technology, but if we just occasionally say no and try and stop the worst, but don't actively take over the agenda for how is technology being used in educating our students, then we kind of lose the game. It's a losing game to just say no. It's important to say no, but it's a losing game if that's all that's in your repertoire. And so that's part of what I'm going to speak to today, to try and articulate some possibilities that I get a sense of here. And one of the striking things already that is clear in the materials that I've read about the work that you're doing and the communications I've heard from some of you over email is that on issues of curriculum, on issues of advising, on issues of 3 and 4 credit courses, faculty here have already been working on developing and presenting, and they have many other things in process, concrete ideas for addressing a whole variety of challenges that this college, like so many others, faces. So this is true, by the way, as well of a variety of other chapters in the state, as you've heard. So just most recently, Suzanne talking about, well, we got this legislation that got passed, that's incredible. We had another piece of legislation, okay, it didn't win, but we got another one coming. It's an iterative process. But part of that game, particularly by way of organizing people and engaging your own colleagues in recognizing the value of what you're doing, is to put forward proposals about how higher education ought to be working, and about how faculty should be treated, about how faculty should be engaged in the strategic choices of the institution, and about where your institution should be going. So again, kudos to you for that work, not only at Fort Lewis, but in the state of Colorado. Okay, so I'm going to, as I said, try and connect process to proposals, but even more than that, to a larger purpose. So that's a further step in what I think is really important in reinvigorating shared governance. Shared governance is one of these interesting things. You miss it the most when it's gone. You can talk to any number of faculty and hear plenty of plenty of stories that aren't always positive stories about their shared governance structures in their colleges and universities. But when it's gone and you have no structure, then I think in some ways you miss it the most. But if shared governance is only about us being consulted so that we have a voice, and that's detached from some sense of where we're going to be pushing the institution, it's actually going to be quite hard to mobilize anyone other than a few of us around this issue. And several of you today have spoken wisely, I think, to the importance of engaging constituencies beyond ourselves. Students, community groups. Students, by the way, have been absolutely central in the organizing of adjunct faculty nationally. And those metro campaigns that you're talking about, every successful one has tapped into students supporting their faculty, getting health care, getting a livable wage, and getting recognized for the professional work that they're doing. So how do we generate that? Well, one way, as I said, is to address process and re-energize and recognize a more inclusive, by the way, idea of shared governance, because the profession has changed since 1966, as I'll talk about. It also involves identifying specific proposals that faculty can get behind. I mentioned that. But beyond that, it goes to a larger purpose and vision about, in your case, the work of Fort Lewis College, or the work of Colorado Mesa, or the work of CSU Pueblo. Who you are as a college, what your role as a faculty is in moving the place closer to fulfilling the purpose not only of that institution, but the promise of American higher education, which in these times is all the more relevant. And that promise is to reduce, not to increase, inequities in society, in the students that we serve and the education that we provide. So that, in my view, is a general and genuine challenge and opportunity that faculty currently confront and can act on, and I think must do so at this juncture of American higher education's history. Because we are in a place where our institutions are moving away from the growth demographics of students in our society and chasing a declining demographic, beautifying their campuses, investing in precisely the sort of thing that you were talking about, Miranda, in the hopes of attracting more upper middle class students and not serving as many of the students who surround Pueblo or Fort Collins or Durango or wherever you happen to be situated, or in my case, Tucson. Recruiting in California and in Illinois and ignoring students in South Tucson. The incredible inequities that we see in society that have emerged to the level of inequities not seen since the Great Depression are something that we are participating in contributing to increasingly as colleges and universities in American higher education. And I think part of our shared governance responsibility is to change that direction. That's actually how the AAUP started. Some of the folks who spoke out earliest and who were non-renewed, Scott Nearing, University of Pennsylvania, the issue that irritated his board of trustees was that he was talking about and arguing against child labor, which was in the early 1900s. At that time, that was pretty controversial. I wouldn't think it would still be controversial, but apparently still in some states and for some state legislators it is. So we need to be speaking out, not just to be speaking out, but speaking out about the issues that define our society's challenge of the day. And what is our purpose? What is our core educational and social purpose in that context? And so let me just say a few words about Fort Lewis that I find is so interesting. It's such a distinctive place in the history of the West. Kathy earlier today spoke to that. And in the history of American higher education, your former Indian boarding school. And you have this distinctive place currently in American higher education. You're a public liberal arts college, not so common. You are a public liberal arts college with engineering and business as major focuses, not so common. You're a public liberal arts college that serves something like 20% of your student population is Native American, and you graduate more Native American students than just about any other four-year institution in the country. You're a public liberal arts college that seeks to bring, and I think this is at issue now, the best features of a good liberal arts education to students often of modest means. Although, if the truth be told, looking around your campus and looking up into the hills, my guess is that you have pretty much a bimodal student population of students who were first in their family to go to college, many cases Native American, a number of other students of color, and then you have a lot of out-of-state students who are a little bit less of that character, that demographic, who are a little more upper middle class and who are a little more likely to be found on the slopes of Telluride than at home on their reservation or in their home communities. That's a challenge for a college to bring those populations in some way together as part of our educational project, which is the point of a liberal arts education is to help people understand how to be thinking critically and acting critically and engaging each other constructively in a democracy. And we're not doing a real good job of that right now in our democracy. And so as you go forward and work to revise your general education curriculum, I hope those kinds of issues are kind of at the heart of your conversations. As is the case with so many other access institutions in your state and in our region, I would count University of Arizona as an access institution. We say we admit only the top 25% of the graduating high school class, but in fact, when June and July comes and we're trying to meet our enrollment targets, we admit the top 40%. Our graduation rate, six-year graduation rate is 60%. That's low for a research university. I know it's higher than yours, which is 38%. That's a challenge also, that the faculty in their shared governance capacity should be taking on. How do we address that? So in our region, these access universities and colleges need to recognize that the future of the country rests on us. It doesn't rest on Harvard, it doesn't rest on Stanford, it doesn't rest on UCLA, it doesn't rest on Michigan or University of Virginia. These are the institutions that educate most of the future students of this country. And it's these institutions that are going to determine whether we move the growth demographics of students in our country who are first in their family to go to college, lower income, students of color, and undocumented students, immigrants, documented and undocumented, whether they get an opportunity to enjoy the promise of higher education that most of the people in my generation had a much better and less expensive route to achieving. So let me offer just an anecdote here by way of kind of clarifying this point and giving you a little bit of sense of myself and maybe the rest of the talk. Last year I was at a conference of presidents of the American Council on Education, folks on the dark side. I was the lone faculty member on a couple of panels speaking about shared governance and how to reinvigorate something that didn't seem to be working so well. This is a conference of presidents, trustees, provosts. It's not just you who think it's not working well. And at that conference, I met with a former student of my center named Stephen Corey. He's currently president of a liberal arts college in Michigan called Olivet College, which also has a very distinctive historical role. It's the first college in Michigan that admitted women and students of color on an equal basis with white men. He's been there 3 years, and when he arrived, the place had declining enrollments, declining tenure-track faculty numbers, and was, unlike you, in a bit of a financial mess. Your finances actually are quite strong. If you have Rudy in here, you'll find they're way more stronger than you might think. But even in the fact book data that's on your website, your expenditures are fewer than your budget. And so that was Stephen's situation. He goes, when he arrived at this place, he said, we had to kind of decide who we wanted to be. There was a lot of pressure from the state, from community, from alumni, for them, from faculty in some cases, for them to move in a different direction, to move away from this historic role of providing education to underserved populations. There was a push for them to be the best, to be like, in their case, this is in Michigan, Albion College, a very selective liberal arts college a little bit north of Ann Arbor. But they really decided, in spite of all the push for greater efficiency and productivity, better graduation rates, a push to move up in the rankings, to attract more students, to generate a whole bunch of new programs that move them away from what their historic mission was, that there was a core commitment among the faculty and among the staff to that historic mission, that there was a widespread commitment to Olivet's role of providing a quality higher education, a quality liberal arts higher education to underserved populations, and to ensure the access and success of those populations at a reasonable cost. Something we haven't talked a lot about today, although that's the defining issue for parents and students in American higher education. That's the kind of choice you have the opportunity to make. What are you going to be about as a public liberal arts college with the history that you have? And what is the role of the faculty going to be in defining that? And how can you take charge of pushing the institution more in a direction that fits the kinds of goals that you see for it, rather than simply involving trying to accommodate or address pressures from the outside that you, like everyone else in the country, is confronting. So, let me just briefly go through my background. I'm a professor. I do research on these topics. Most of the students that I have, however, are not going to become professors. About 10 or 15% do, but most go into support professions and student affairs and academic affairs. Some even moved into academic administration, like Ken in the back, Papian. My research focus is on restructuring of American higher education. That's been my focus since I started doing research in 1981, and it's an ever-timely topic, and also the restructuring of the academic workforce. I served for a couple of years, as Jonathan said, as General Secretary of the AAUP, but I'm also an equal opportunity provider of input and support to all sorts of academic groups, labor unions and advocacy groups, whether it's the NEA, AFT, SEIU with their adjunct action campaigns in metropolitan areas around the country, UAW with postdocs, and NFM, which is the new faculty majority, which would love to get a copy of Caprice's cookbook. Now, Caprice, do you know about the new faculty majority? Yeah. And there's some adjunct activists in the state who are very much connected with NFM. I'm on the board of NFM. Part of this is to let you know you're not only part of a chapter at the AU, at Fort Lewis College, an AUP chapter here. You're not only part of the state conference, you're not only part of the national AUP with a lot of excellent resources that have been referred to in history. You're part of a national labor movement. And a lot of that labor movement has to do with just the sorts of activities that we heard, particularly in the last panel, about do people who are employed by large institutions deserve to have health care? or even shots. Amazing story. And I'm very much a part of pushing for a renegotiation of the terms and conditions of employment, not just for professionals, but for all employees. And that story that came out in Pittsburgh about Margaret Mary Wojciko, who'd been teaching something like 30 years, a French professor, as an adjunct, was a very powerful story. CNN came to me and wanted me to do a little piece on that, so I did a piece called "The New Working Poor." That's the academic profession of the new working poor, because the majority of us are contingent. We are all contingent in one way or another, but the majority of us are working in particularly contingent positions. So that's where I'm coming from. But at the same time, I'm also on task forces, as I mentioned, with ACE, with the Association of Governing Boards, and I just want to mention this for perspective. I was on one task force called Presidents in the Middle. And I'm thinking, in the middle of what? Like, what are they in the middle of? Oh, they're in the middle of being pushed and pulled, pushed by faculty who are giving them votes of no confidence, pushed by boards that are firing them left and right. If you follow the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, there's a lot of turnover of presidents. Pushed by all sorts of external pressures from state legislators, from accrediting bodies, from competition for for-profit institutions. So when I'm in those meetings, the jokes that I hear are not about the administrators, the jokes I hear about faculty. And there are many of the things that you've articulated here. We're seen as obstacles. And often we are, because we're skeptical. Healthily skeptical. Not always healthily skeptical, but there's a healthiness to skepticism. We ask questions. We pose alternatives. We question the premises and arguments of managers. How dare we? Throughout that meeting, I kept trying to articulate, it was a day and a half meeting, faculty are not the enemy. We're the people who are teaching the students. Faculty are not the enemy. And then at some point, some stories started coming out about initiatives that faculty had undertaken at their campuses that actually were productive, positive initiatives. That was good, but then I tried to take the next step, which is, if you don't persuade the faculty, or if you don't learn from your faculty about the initiatives to take, whatever change you're trying to implement, it's not going to stick. It's a lot easier to shake a place up in the short term, to put it into upheaval, than to institutionalize enduring change. If you're going to institutionalize enduring change, faculty need to be at the center of that. And that's the beauty and the history of shared governance, and of an independent faculty voice in trying to define the future of an institution and trying to chart that future. If we're not part of that process, it's not going to go down well. And you're kind of experiencing that right now. Even in Fort Lewis College, which I think on the spectrum of horribleness we heard this morning, is not at the worst end of that spectrum. Similarly, AGB Task Force on College and University Governance. Again, I'm the lone faculty member. These are mostly board members, not presidents, but a few presidents. They all think there's something wrong with shared governance. It's not working. And then the principle is everybody's unhappy. Like the faculty recognize it's not working because it's being ignored, and the administration doesn't think it's really. What's going on here? The chair of that committee, or task force, is a former governor of Tennessee, Phil Bredesen. And he started out, I think, fairly skeptical about the value of shared governance. In fact, after one of the last meetings, I was talking with him afterwards over a couple of beers, and he says, I started out, I'm a former mayor, I'm a former governor, and all this conversation about faculty needing to have a voice. Why? He says, I just didn't get it. But in the course of the conversation over multiple meetings, and this is not a conversation with AUP. This is actually a conversation with presidents and trustees. I got the sense that this thing needs to be reinvigorated. And that there really is a value to it, because if the professionals working in the organization are not part of the decision making, it ain't going anywhere. So that's my sense of our need to reinvigorate shared governance. We need to make it more inclusive, and so the discourse in most of the settings I go, on either side of the aisle, is that whatever shared governance mechanisms we have now, they are woefully inadequate to incorporating the genuine, fear-free input of the 2/3 of the faculty who are contingent. And we need to work on that ourselves, amongst ourselves, even as we try to regain some semblance of shared governance in our interactions with administration. And at the same time, we need to embed this idea of reinvigorating shared governance beyond ourselves, so that we help students and communities understand the value of what we're doing. And I think in a liberal arts college, it's not a hard pitch. So the idea that, as Brian said earlier today, the working conditions of the faculty are the learning conditions of their students. If faculty are afraid to speak out, have no voice in the organization in which they work, what is that modeling for our students in a liberal arts college that claims to be about preparing people who are critical thinkers? It just gives the lie to it. It's a bit like the lie that we pitch that's embedded in the working conditions of contingent faculty, because the story that we tell to our students is spend a lot of money, accrue a lot of student debt, and you get a degree and the world is your oyster. You get a good job. The secret, the dirty little secret, is they're being taught. And it's not only in community colleges. Half the faculty nationally are part-time. They're not just contingent faculty. Half the faculty nationally are part-time. Another 20% are full-time, non-tenure track. So the people teaching you follow that advice. Get a degree. They got advanced degrees. And this is how they're being treated as employees. So we need to out that and challenge it, and we need to do that amongst ourselves as well as in our conversations with others. Okay, what's happening elsewhere? So as Jonathan said, I spent a little time not only doing research but traveling to a lot of places. Just a few weeks ago I was at Kent State University actually in a similar kind of gathering. The context is different, much bigger university, unionized. But after a previous administration, shared governance has sort of gone by the wayside, even though that is a bargaining unit that has outstanding language on shared governance. So let me give you this sort of larger context. This is a 30-year pattern that we're talking about to frame what's going on. And that's generally what I try and do in these sorts of meetings or presentations, because that's generally what people are asking me to do when I come in. I recall Jonathan's initial inquiry to me. I think the subject line of the email was something like, "Colorado is going crazy." It was, right?
It was.
I
had to get your attention.
It did. It did. And certainly Colorado, like I said, you've had more than your share of national news in higher education for not so good things in recent months and years. But the roots of what you're experiencing in Colorado go way deeper than the last few years, and they go way beyond your state's borders. And they go way beyond the Four Corners region that you're in. So these are national trends. So I just sort of map out here. As early as the early 1980s, there was a book written by a guy named George Keller. It was a bestseller. Not too many books on higher ed ended up being bestsellers. It was reviewed in the Washington Post. Again, not so common. The whole pitch of this book, which was called Academic Strategy, the Management Revolution in American Higher Education, the whole premise is that higher ed institutions are rudderless. They need direction, and that direction is up to central managers to do that work. Faculty, the subtext is, are self-interested. They're focused only on their disciplines. They only care about their research. And that institutions, in order to be more strategic, more focused, and to affect real change, need strong leadership. And I mean, it's just that kind of discourse that Kathy was referring to earlier today. So if you're against this particular change, this means you're against any change and you're against your students. It's that kind of discourse that's been percolating for really 30 years. Then we've seen a fundamental restructuring of the workforce, such that part-time faculty have gone from being 22% of the faculty in the 1970s to 49% of the faculty. Non-tenure track, full-time non-tenure track faculty have gone from being 3% in the 70s to 19%. So, and to the majority of new hires. The majority of new hires, full-time hires, are off the tenure track. Then there's a rise of support managerial professionals, like the 6 advisors who I gather were just hired at this college. I can't say too much, some of these are my students. Howard Luntz always teases me, it's your fault, Rhoades, that this managerial professional group is rising. You educate them. Faculty at one time were 66% of the professional workforce, we're now closer to 50%. Then there's a restructuring of management that goes with that, and a whole discourse. They're now CEOs, they're not presidents. It's a much more corporate model of management. We can't afford the messiness and slowness of shared governance. And this is the problem with shared governance, is it's too slow, it takes too long, it's not decisive, it's not innovative enough. All of this sort of logic of the marketplace, which I've written about with Sheila Slaughter in a book on academic capitalism, that incorporates the logic of the market, the brand, as Jonathan so nicely referred to, and some others. The balance between managerial discretion and academic autonomy is shifting, and it's shifting partly because of this fundamental shift in the workforce, and it's also shifting even in relation to tenure track faculty, and you obviously know in which direction. That clue to that shift is in the title of my book on restructuring academic labor, that they are increasingly managed professionals. All of this is in the context, and it's heightened in the context of hyper-accountability, of measurement, of assessment, of student learning outcomes, of accrediting bodies which actually are worried about their own future existence and which try to change and accommodate to the external pressures that they're experiencing. To push at the state level for greater productivity, which generally means higher graduation rates. Greater efficiency, which generally means do more with less. And to so-called seamless transitions and transfer among institutions within a state and from 2 to 4 year institution. That's what I hear. And I also hear an overriding mantra about a lack of voice when I travel around the country, or a lack of a meaningful role in shared governance, a lack of respect, a sense of being ignored, dismissed, or just entirely overlooked, or overruled consistently, not in exceptional cases, as Steve so nicely articulated about the 66 statement. Then there's a fear of retaliation for speaking up, for raising questions, for not getting on board the train that has presumably left the station, or the horse that has left the barn, or whatever your favorite metaphor is, or that you're subjected to. So you're not alone. I recall once, about 8 years ago, 10 years ago now, in my institution, I was on a faculty senate committee on planning and budget. We had a provost, happily outgoing provost, who was trying to convince us that he was usually given the military metaphors. In this case, he shifted to music. He said, a university is like a symphony. and I'm the conductor. And everybody needs to be on the same page, otherwise the music just sounds awful. And so I kind of heard that and I said, well, the problem with that is, first, you got a strange conception of classical music, but holding that aside, a university is not a symphony, it's a jam session of jazz musicians. You don't know our instruments, you can't play half of them. And by the way, you will be gone and we will stay, and we were here before you came. So the game is not that we have to get on board with you. The game in these institutions is that there can be some creative tension, but it can't be just one group calling the shots, which is so often what we're put in the position of. So the pattern is generally one of shared governance not just being abolished, but being bypassed. So I just want to give a sense. Here's what shared governance is not. Remember the 3D glasses? You sit in an auditorium and my two daughters, now 30 and 27, had a math teacher in high school he was fabulous, Tommy Teagard. And he had this phrase, math is not a spectator sport. Well, shared governance is not a spectator sport. So here's a variety of things that shared governance is not. Shared governance is not town hall meetings in which faculty ask a few questions and let off some steam. It's not web portals, circulars, blogs, or cyber suggestion boxes. It's not spontaneous sporadic meetings and ad hoc committees that are reporting to a particular administrator. Those are superficial substitutes for what really is joint sharing of responsibility for moving an institution forward in systematic, ongoing, structured work. Shared governance is not at will, like at-will employment, where there's no due process. It's not just ad hoc, it's systemic and systematic. So why should we do shared? Why should governance be shared? A couple thoughts about this. Speed kills. We don't need faster. We see a lot of really fast initiatives, but we don't need faster choices. We need more creative, smarter choices. We don't need tough choices, because I don't know if you've noticed, the tough choices are being made by most colleges and universities around the country. Most colleges and universities around the country are not particularly investing in humanities. They're not particularly investing in traditional liberal arts fields. They tend to be going more for, I gather STEM is popular here. If everybody's making that choice, apparently it's just not all that tough. We don't need to be benchmarking ourselves against our aspirational peers, which usually means in higher education our in your dreams peers, not a chance in hell peers, snowball chance in hell peers. And so I come to the point about the story about jazz sessions, jam sessions. The challenge in all this is not, it's not a matter of time, it's trust. It's less a matter of following that one path or that one script than it is of fostering a lot of different possibilities. And it's less about just initiating change than about institutionalizing. And that's where I think you have an opportunity. Particularly with an impending visit from the Higher Learning Commission. So I guess what I want to close with is you have an opportunity now. You've got the attention of your administration with some fairly thoughtfully worded communications on which you copied not only your board, and I'd really caution against seeing boards as your saviors, but copying a higher learning commission. And so you have the attention of the administration. Now the question is what to do with that attention. What are your next steps in moving forward? So here's what I'm going to suggest, just as some possibilities for triggering thought, not because I think these are any particular answers, but because I think you do have an opportunity that Mesa and Pueblo seem to have moved far beyond. One opportunity is there are some things that you're in the process of thinking about implementing and having discussions about implementing. And your challenge is to recognize amongst yourselves as faculty, across the divides that separate you, that you have power, that you are policymakers, even in this case. Not only in providing obstacles, and not only just in developing plans, but in recalibrating and operationalizing what will it mean, what are the details that surround the possibilities of moving more to a 3-unit than to a mixed 3 and 4 unit course model. What are the possibilities that you can work out amongst yourselves to define a future set of working conditions that more fully capture your hopes collectively for this college? And what I've heard from this morning, and what I hear in the informal conversations as well, is some of those challenges are as great amongst yourselves as they are with administration. So you need to be solid collectively. And you need to recognize, I think, that sometimes, even if it's not a policy you're thrilled about, you can get a lot out of defining the implementation of it. Many years ago, there was a president of a bargaining unit, really powerful progressive bargaining unit, who called me and said, we're in negotiations. At our university, we have a 5-year probationary period, not the standard 6-year. The administration has put down at the bargaining table, they want a 6-year probationary period. Our faculty don't want that. They don't want an extension of ambiguity in probation. What do you think we should do? I said, well, your choice. You're at the table. You are, as you've said yourself, outside the norm, so that's something you might lose. If you're going to lose it, what are you going to get for it? So what's also common nationally with the 6-year probationary period is that you get time off during that probationary period to prepare for the tenure process. So that could be a fallback position. And that actually is exactly what that president of the bargaining unit went back and with her bargaining team decided to do. You're in a situation where you're apparently in process of moving to a 3-unit model. You have an opportunity to define what are the terms and conditions that surround how many course preps, what kind of work gets counted as opting you out of a 4th course if you're in the humanities or social sciences, and how to embed that in a structure that won't just be taken away the next year or 2 or 3 years later. You're in a position of being able to say, if we're going to be doing this collapsing of courses, do we get professional development money to do it? It's not a financially strapped college. It's pretty common to give faculty members developmental monies for developing online courses. Why not for collapsing or changing 3 to 4 unit courses or 4 to 3 unit courses or whatever it is? So within the constraints of what you're facing, what can you negotiate? I think the learning outcomes language, again, it's like instructional modalities and technology. If we cede it to someone else, we'll get the worst. we need to take control of and define for ourselves what those learning outcomes are, how they'll be measured, and then we need to evaluate how they're working for not individual faculty members and individual students, but for students as a whole. So even if you feel the demand to develop and formalize them is problematic, and that's a contested issue and a vexed issue among faculty, I encourage you to take on that shared governance responsibility, which I think was very much part of Jonathan's rightful analysis of IT issues. That's a shared governance issue about a basic working condition that defines what we're able to do with our students. The same is true with these sorts of learning outcomes. The same with general education. But there's two larger issues there, and then I'll close with this. General education is a question of, the challenge you're facing is a question of what is a liberal education in the 21st century? Your traditional liberal arts curriculum includes fields that 20 or 30 years ago didn't exist. Gender and women's studies, American Indian studies, and indigenous studies. And elsewhere, institutions have a range of liberal arts fields which didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago. What combinations of courses and materials are you positioned to creatively construct in this project? And again, as I understand it, that's as much a negotiation among science and social science and humanities faculty as it is between you and the administration. The value of a liberal education, though it's not always in the exact confines of existing conceptions of our fields, is fundamental to our future in a variety of ways. And you're in a position of being able to identify and define what that means for your institution and your students right now. All of these things involve, whatever path you choose, involves restoring a balance of power and refocusing us on our public purpose. So reinvigorating shared governance requires exercising voice and power. And you at Fort Lewis College are doing that. As I said, you've gotten the attention of the management, and now's the time to pivot and to grow your chapter and increase your numbers by doing demonstrably important work in constructing creative approaches to the policies and the challenges that you confront as a college. That balance of power in pursuit of a common public purpose will best serve and will be best served by a strong faculty as well as a strong academic management. And it requires not just thinking about our voice, but thinking about our voice in relation to our role as guardians of the public trust, and refocusing more of the conversations in our institutions on those larger issues that workers nationally are confronting. So just as adjuncts are talking about, adjunct faculty are talking about, what if we take a day off and do a nationwide strike? We saw not long ago fast food workers do the same thing. And those two movements are actually very much linked. We need to tap into that kind of energy when we're thinking about and talking about shared governance. Because we're not going to win these kinds of battles alone. We need to engage our communities and our students in understanding what the importance of a genuine liberal arts, enlightened liberal arts education is for our society. Thank you. Questions?
very much. That was wonderful. So one of the continuing roadblocks I feel like faculty have been up against as we've moved to this, as we redesign, but this was in the discourse long before we went to 3 credits, and now we're in this process of redesigning our curriculum. And in this really interesting way, the administration has taken control of our curriculum in a way that's terrifying, and changing all the processes of how we submit curriculum. And when you bring up arguments about it and say, well, why, whoa, this is intense, why are we doing this? There's so much pushback from now all these new people that have been hired that say, well, the state says you have to do this, and the state says you have to do that, and you have to map this outcome to that outcome, and you have to, blah, and they kind of give you this dizzying speech that you just, okay, and I don't know how. I think we've had a hard time responding to that because we don't actually really understand what's happening at the state. So I don't know, I need advice on how to respond to that sort of rhetoric.
So, a couple of thoughts about that. Did everybody hear the question? Yeah. Almost never do external directives or pressures from states or accrediting bodies force precisely the actions that we're all experiencing. So we already heard a really nice discussion of that and thinking about going to the HLC, looking at their provisions, and saying, well, wait a minute, I don't see that here. One of the roles that a chapter can play is faculty are busy, right? We don't have time to go, all the faculty at Fort Lewis College don't have the time to individually go to the HLC site and say, well, let's check this out, or go to the legislation and say, let's check this out. Part of the role of a chapter is to mobilize expertise, pursue some issues like that, and inform the faculty about, it is true that there's an increasing pressure to focus on learning outcomes. At the same time, it is also true that the way in which you do that, how you define them, how you define credit hours, is an open issue that is up to your collective decision-making internally. Right? So I think one of the responses I would have to that is, well actually, here's my gut level response. I'm also an academic administrator. I'm a department head. I'm a director of the center. Although I'm in denial about that. So we're at a recent department head retreat where the vice provost for academic and faculty affairs said, I know folks in the room have some ambiguity about whether you're a faculty member, whether you're part of management. I said, I don't have any ambiguity at all. I'm a faculty member. The role of an academic administrator is to buffer the faculty against the stupidest, this is Tim's, it's to buffer the faculty against the stupidest of the external excesses, not to serve as not only a condiment, but an augmenter of that stupidity. And I'm not speaking to the individuals, I'm talking about the measures, which are almost always articulated by people that know nada, zilch, nothing about the work processes that they're trying to regulate. And so they usually make a muddle of it at best, as we're hearing with the IT case, but it's true in curriculum as well. So the first role, I think, of an academic administrator is not just transmit and be like a piece of metal in water to the electricity that's coming from whatever source, but to buffer and give space for, well, let's pursue some creative ways of thinking about X, Y, or Z. Most of the external pressure is open to that kind of negotiation. It doesn't mean you can't do nothing. It just means what exactly you're going to do is really pretty much up to you. And so I think, again, the role of the chapter is to help pursue on a couple of basic issues. So, and you've got a great state conference here that positions you to be able to do that. What actually are the pressures of the HLC? Your letter did a nice job of saying, well, wait a minute, if this is a problem with HLC, how do we get accredited? And how do we get reaccredited 10 years ago? the reasonable answer to that is the HLC itself is under pressure. So I was on a task force 4 years ago where the discussion was, should we eliminate regional accrediting bodies? Because they don't focus enough on learning outcomes. And so it's not just the HLC, but a variety of other accrediting bodies start paying more attention to. But that doesn't mean they're telling you exactly how to do it. And it doesn't mean you don't have the discretion to define it in ways that might actually enhance the education, curriculum and education of your students. It does mean that you're having to spend ungodly, bloody amounts of time in committee meetings doing it every 2 or 3 years. And so I think that was a kind of a proposal you threw out, Kathy, in your presentation. Can we acknowledge the level of shared governance work that's involved in doing this kind of reorganization of curriculum and transition from 4 to 3 units by saying that's like a buyout? The time that you spend on that is a buyout from your 4th class? Can we think just in terms of basic workload about that? But then beyond that, it's up to you to define how you fulfill that external pressure, how you respond to it. You don't just have to cave to it. You can creatively buffer yourself from it. And at the same time, hopefully do something to actually, look, the graduation rate for my institution is not great, it's 60%. It should be improving. We're doing things internally in my center among us as faculty to try and study how do you make that better. You could be doing the same thing if you're thinking about restructuring or reorganizing your general education curriculum. There is some room for improvement, right? It's enraging that there are external folks who have little respect for and less understanding of what you do who are pushing you to do it. But the reality is, we haven't done it, and there is room for improvement in enhancing the way that we serve our students. And so your challenge is to kind of say, nah, we're not just going to knee-jerk say, yeah, of course we have to do this. We're going to construct some alternatives that keep the dogs at bay, but don't give up our basic right to define what the curriculum is. And it's not just our right. They can't define. They don't understand it. They're not the conductor who plays every instrument. They don't get it. So I think that would be my response about, it's also a response to your challenge, which is you got a big chapter in a small faculty, right, where there are 200 or so, I think Brian said something, like maybe 200 tenure stream faculty here.
No, we're down at about 125.
So 125, so on the website I saw it at 181, so.
It's a lie, like many things
Yeah.
here. No, it's about 125 on the tenure track, and then everybody else is 1 year.
Okay, so still a relatively small faculty, right? You got a big chapter of 30-some people, but you probably also have a lot of folks who are either, and you made reference to this, I think Brian did, they're not actively participating because they're a little worried, or they're mad at you, or they're worried, or some of them are just too busy and they're complacent. So part of your game as a chapter is how do you position yourself to strengthen the perception of you among the faculty. And I think a way of doing that is to be the measured, informed analyst of what actually is the push and how could we address that in ways other than what we're doing now. Other questions? Kathy?
A question, but I don't know whether institutions have this, that we have an internalized externality, which is they've hired two, a director of assessment and a director of online education, who are paid more, each of them, than many full professors.
Absolutely.
And they're the ones, and they're not, and their activities extend way, they've been deputized to actually be the ones running trying to run the Gen Ed Council. I was called in on the carpet by those two, because I didn't pass a rough draft of something I was writing as a faculty member so they could see it. And it's weird, and I tried to explain to them, I said, it's not personal, but we don't know how to deal with you. You're not administration, you're not faculty, influential, powerful, and it's a buffer so that we don't have to deal with senior administrators who they move us back around, but they interact with associate deans to send them directives about how they should be directing chairs. It's really bizarre. And I haven't read anything quite in the literature. You know, they talk about deanlets and people like that, but this is a new mini managerial class that's we're gaining power here.
Absolutely. So, and that relates actually to one of the questions in the last session about the way that adjunct faculty or contingent faculty generally and tenure track faculty are played off against each other. Like, we don't have enough money for both of you. The reality is the share of money that goes to instruction nationally in every institutional sector is declining and has been for over 15 years. Now, Howard Bunces and Rudy Fichtenbaum will come out to your particular place and give you the gory details on it, and it will be brilliant and very compelling. So the first thing is what you're seeing isn't an anomaly. What you're seeing is a growth of a range of positions, offices, that are neither central administration nor faculty, just as you described. And it's that category that I've called managerial professionals. They often have advanced degrees. They often go to meetings about assessment, for example. So it's a professionalizing field. The same thing is true in technology. You have teaching center folks, people in instructional and learning technologies and teaching technologies who go to an entirely separate conference from any academic conference. They may never have been faculty, but they now claim expertise over classrooms,
Yeah.
right? And that's part of the sort of intrusion into what was traditionally a faculty realm. So this is the same thing that is happening that you're experiencing. I think you gave a really nice public explanation of how, just from an organizational standpoint, there's this confusing array of people. Who are they? What's their responsibility? That's not a path to a constructive shared governance engagement. The constructive path to a shared governance engagement is to understand the roles and responsibilities of the different parties involved and to coordinate and decide upon your division of labor accordingly. But no, what you're experiencing is absolutely the dominant trend.
And then put on committees as
Yes,
faculty committees.
absolutely.
All of it.
Absolutely.
Members who sit in front at the
Absolutely.
meeting.
Absolutely. And so I think that's part of you having to renegotiate. Hang on a second here. If we're going to be moving down this path, we need to understand what the different roles are, what our role is. And you have to acknowledge and accept a level of expertise about this stuff that has to do with the curriculum, that doesn't accord to, and you also could put yourself in the position of being the evaluators of their initiatives. I mean, you made some reference, or somebody did make reference to evaluating academic administrators. That is like a chapter and verse foundational point. And I don't remember if it was Steve or someone else who said it on the state conference panel, that you need to be able to be evaluating academic administrators. That's fundamentally important. But what's also important is as you undergo these initiatives and you put something into place, you should be evaluating how's it working. And faculty actually can do research on things and do interviews and do surveys and assess the assessors. You can imagine doing that with technology. Is this new technology? There's only a few places nationally where the faculty have gotten together and said, we want to know whether this technology that we've adopted, basically without any consultation, is it working? I mean, the premise is all of our millennial students can function so perfectly. Not true, as anyone who teaches knows. Is it working for all? Is it working for some categories of students and not others? We should be collectively evaluating some of these processes ourselves. Again, that's something I think a chapter can do. Jonathan?
So you go to meetings and hang out with these fascists. So I'm sorry, was that too strong a word? I mean, do the boards, do they see a value in shared governance? It seems like the example just given of this managerial class, it seems like it's a kind of, I don't want to keep yanking these political chains, but it's like it's a post-Reagan Thatcher kind of, just centralized control, and well, if the way to deal with the obstreperous faculty is just put another layer of management on top of it, and do they, on the other side of these barriers, do they see any, is there any possible meeting of the mind? I've never had a conversation with one of these people. You have. Is there a possible meeting of the mind?
The sad reality is, most of these people are us. I mean, the reality is, most of these people are us. Your provost was you.
No, but I'm talking about the boards of governors.
No, but let's just,
the rancher.
the boards are not hiring these people. It's the administrations that are doing this. So I mean, really seriously, at the board level and the national level, it is a systemic trend that is beyond, it's not partisan. It is bipartisan. The sorts of pushes on the vocationalization of community colleges and the short cycling of education in community colleges is as strong or stronger under the Obama administration than it was under the Bush administration. Right? So it's a bipartisan, neoliberal, if we're going to use some language, it's a neoliberal push for greater accountability, which means you starve for 30 years the public sector, and then you evaluate it and say it's not meeting your objectives, then you kill it. At the same time that you're subsidizing a for-profit sector, right? Like we're literally subsidizing. You mentioned the for-profit that took over the institution. There are two for-profits now that, here's something that is a little more partisan. The Obama administration has gone after some for-profits. So ITT Tech and Corinthian colleges are being investigated. Corinthian is closing like 3/4 of its campuses. But every year, those two colleges nationally get $1.6 and $1.2 billion of federal financial aid, because that's how they make their money. They make 80 to 90% of their money from federal financial aid. So there's this systemic trend. I'm a believer in the possibility of negotiating within that systemic trend different terms and conditions of work, and then being part of a regional, a state, a national movement that pushes back in the other direction. And the reality is that your students are allies in this. And I don't mean go into the classroom and preach to them, but if you open a class by saying, I'm an adjunct faculty member, and if you wonder, I mean, I've heard a brilliant exposition of this from a guy in New York City, teaches at 4 different colleges to put together a living. If you're wondering why I'm not available at this time, in this, it's because I'm teaching here and here and here and here. That's why I'm less available. My working conditions are your learning conditions. Now, so to answer your question, is this some, it's beyond individuals, it's a systemic pattern. But folks are not just fascists. I mean, that's too easy to, it's fun to do, but the funny thing about occasionally going into that world is the stories are just as nasty and one-sided about faculty, which is why now one meeting, I'm like, here's my message to you all. The faculty are not the enemy. We're not the enemy. We're the people who are teaching the students at your institution. We're not the enemy. So the problem that we face isn't them only. The problem we face is what the public thinks of us as well. And so that's why I'm suggesting that part of our pitch about shared governance has to be not just about us and, hey, how come we weren't consulted? Because if you talk to 90% of the people who work in the region of Durango, they don't have much say in what their business does either, if they're employees. You have to connect. We have to connect our claim, which I fundamentally believe in, to shared governance, to a public purpose for the academy. And so I guess what I want to do is, I'm kind of fudging your question a little bit, and I'd fail on the 3-minute monitor that you had to abide by. But yes, I think it is possible to work with some people. If I was at Colorado Mesa, I'd have a totally different response. If I was at Pueblo, a different response. If I was at your institutions, I'd be doing the social media, you kick their butts, bravo. I think it depends on the context, whether or not it's workable.
I'm not sure I want to go with fascist, but I do want to just sort of educate you with something that seems peculiarly Colorado and is very local, which is we have an awful lot of college presidents who really aren't us. Someone help me, Boulder.
Lloyd Benson?
Yeah,
Bruce Benson.
yeah, so where's he from? Like the petroleum industry?
Yeah.
Geology.
Our ex-president is now running CHE, is a lawyer and random political appointment.
Totally true.
I mean, just a ton about Mesa, right? Former head of the state legislators, the Senate, and they bring in lots of people who work alongside them, who literally are not us either, and not only that, know nothing about higher education. In the case of CSU Pueblo, our chief financial officer is from the prison system. Seems weirdly appropriate in some ways. Help me, Jane, who else do we have who's nowhere near us? I mean, our lawyer is, incredibly powerful, and she knows
Absolutely.
nothing, literally nothing about higher education.
I totally understand it, but it's not Colorado only.
Okay.
There are increasing numbers of presidents who come from outside of higher education.
So maybe I'm going to rephrase Jonathan's question. How do we talk to people who know nothing about what we do all day?
We're educators. And I don't say that flippantly. So in Arizona, when I first started there, we do a lot of things sort of knee-jerk in response to California. And at some point within the first 4 or 5 years that I was at Arizona, the board started pursuing this tenure thing. God, let's just do away with tenure. This is ridiculous. The presidents of the 3 public universities in Arizona, 2 of them are research universities, Northern Arizona, Arizona State, and University of Arizona. They got pretty worried because they understood they're not stupid. For the most part, let me just say, there are some stupid people in the world. I'm going to grant you that. Most presidents, they're not stupid. They may be ignorant. They're not stupid. Don't underestimate your enemies or your adversaries. They were kind of panicked, like, what the hell do we do? Because if we don't have tenure at the University of Arizona, nobody's coming here, and we're going down, and then how am I going to move on to the next university? Like, this will not look good on my portfolio. What they are is differentially motivated. If you're a provost or a president, how are you, when you apply for that next job, you've got to show that you've done something. Right? You got to have, and if you say, well, I facilitated some wonderful conversations among a group of faculty who did some very cool things in undergraduate education. On the other hand, if you say, we shifted from, and we implemented this, right? So anyway, what happened in Arizona was these presidents were pretty much at a loss. What are we going to do? How are we going to head this thing off at the pass? Well, there were faculty councils for each of those universities, which hadn't really worked together all that much previously. They got together and they said, we're educators. Let's work the board and educate them as to what the tenure process is. And so they went to the board with a range of promotion and tenure files. They walked them through the process. And they pretty much succeeded at holding at bay what at the time was a fairly serious consideration of, let's just have a fundamental attack on tenure. Your situation, again, the context varies. Presidents are really important. They're more important externally oftentimes than they are internally. You're often dealing more with a provost. I think that may be the case at Fort Lewis than you are with the president. There's no doubt that a bunch of people are gaining power internally. who come from outside of academia. Lawyers are a perfect example. Human resource managers are another example. But it is not something that's specific to you as a state. What I think is specific to your state is something I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about, but I went on too long. Your state has been impacted or infiltrated, depending upon your choice of terms, by a national body called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, which is a very, very conservative. We need to be teaching the classics. Anyone who doesn't know and can't cite 45 facts about each of the founding fathers, forget the mothers, is ignorant. This is a very conservative body, and they promote a very activist approach by boards. And they have come out with a recent statement on governance in a new era, which you guys might want to consider coming out with a response to. It's signed by a range of people. One of the people who signed it is Hank Brown. That's a name you probably know, former senator in Colorado, former president, right, of University of Colorado. The pitch of this document is, times are changing so fast, we need a new kind of governance. And you notice there's no shared in the discussion of governance. It's so much to the extreme that the Association of Governing Boards has come out with a counter to it. And this task force, in a way, is a counter to it. Like, shared governance is important. Now, they may think about it differently than I do, but at least they're using the word and paying some attention to the idea that we should have faculty involved. They're more interested in buy-in than they are in getting challenged and getting new ideas, but at least they're using the term. They're not wanting to do away with, they're not suggesting that trustees should go in and make suggestions about curriculum. So in that regard, Colorado is distinctive. Now, I don't know if how many of you followed the University of Virginia debacle, where they fired a president who'd been hired like 2 years previously, and it was like a coup by a couple of board members. The faculty went nuts, the Senate signed a letter, the deans went nuts, students went nuts, alumni went nuts. ACTA, this American Council of Trustees and Alumni, was very supportive of the board going in there and saying, this president is not doing this and this and this and this, and she's allowing faculty to do this and this and this. It's that kind of behavior that is encouraged in the orientations. These folks go through orientations, and ACTA does orientations. They send out briefs, they do webinars, and so I think that's something for you as a conference to think about, how to respond to that. And it's good to know that there is another organization, which AGB, there are many differences between the AUP and AGB on the AGB's more recent statements on institutional governance. But they're not at the point that ACTA is at. So AGB endorsed the 1966 statement, but there have been two subsequent statements, one in 2010. They still at least acknowledge the value and the importance of engaging faculty in shared governance. And so I would encourage you guys to think about this. In that way, you are distinctive. ACTA is really strong in Colorado.
Yeah, they write legislation, and they deliver it to anybody who will listen,
Yeah.
particularly Republican representatives
Yeah.
and senators. So we've had some confrontations with them in the past. In fact, we defeated a proposal to abolish tenure here in 2000. That was one of the opening shots of our state conference.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing about that, Gary, is that none, and I want to repeat this, not a single representative of the administration of a Colorado State University showed up to testify at that committee. Now, they did have their lobbyists behind the scenes. No public figure, no public face showed up. Am I right? Yeah. And it was us and the ACLU.
Mm-hmm.
But we made exactly the case that you just articulated, which was that we were going to go down the tubes in terms of recruitment. If this is a national game we're playing, and et cetera. But absolutely right, and ACT is very much active here, and Tim Foster's sort of a guru in terms of a local representative of the ACT folks, and at the time that he was in the Owens administration, with CCHE, then ACT essentially owned CCHE. And so we've had that kind of problem. It's going to be an ongoing issue for us. I have another question, though, and that has to do with something that's been bugging me lately. It happened for Collins, but we've seen it in Pueblo, and we've seen it. This is the increasing role of university attorneys.
Yes.
And now this is something that I think is really new, qualitative, new and different.
Yes.
And what they are saying, what they're basically saying is you can't take risks. You cannot take risks. It's a very backward-looking approach. And so we've had to make the case that it's the faculty that has to think about society. It's the faculty that moves forward. You wouldn't have a civil rights movement and any successes if it had been left to the attorneys. Okay? Really? Attorneys are not progressive. There are a few of them. But they don't think that way, they don't operate that way, and when you're in your institutions, you should not necessarily assume that they're the enemy, but they're definitely the adversary because they're looking in another direction. And the advice they're going to give your president and your provost is going to be a different kind of advice, probably, than you would want to advise those folks about. So it's a really interesting issue, and I assume that we were seeing this nationally. Is that right?
It is definitely the case. Probably the easiest way to articulate it. It's not, it's to your point, although it's not to advocacy chapters in Colorado. In collective bargaining settings, there is an increasing presence, not only of university attorneys on the management bargaining team, but of hiring external attorneys to run the bargaining. And in fact, that was the issue at, sorry.
No, you're fine.
That was the issue that I spoke to at Kent State, one of the issues. That they had a former president and a university attorney who gauged their success, literally, on whether the faculty were out there doing votes of no confidence on the administration. Oh, good, you're kicking butt and taking names. Good for you. So, I mean, the whole sort of, and now they've hired an external person to run their negotiations. Part of the pitch that I made, and actually another person made who's been negotiating faculty contracts from management side for 30 years, is you want the people negotiating the contract who have to live with the consequences and work with the people they're negotiating with. You don't want some external person who has no understanding of this place, who picks up their feet, goes off, and does the same damage at another place. You want to be dealing with people with whom you have some sort of ongoing relationship. And I think in terms of change issues, it's always a position for faculty to be able to take. We are the long-term people here. Right? Almost always. More of the faculty, most of the faculty have been at a place considerably longer than the senior administrators. And they will post-date those administrators, because the average tenure now of a president nationally is 6 years, 7 years, at most, and dropping. So yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. And when the lawyers are in the room to begin with, all creativity is lost, and all the focus is on avoid risk, avoid risk, avoid risk. That's how they see their role. So I think that's an absolutely right
I mean, at this point, I think in our state, it's become a threat to shared governance in that aspect. And so we really have to speak up about that. I have a little correspondence with Tony Frank personally on this very issue. And curiously enough, he sort of partially agrees with me.
Well, what's worse?
We have to keep it up.
What is worse is we've got this woman, Donna Stinkin' Doyle, who's writing policies
Right.
and taking charge. I mean, you talk about a threat to shared governance, she's the wrecking ball. I mean, everywhere she goes, it's just a path of destruction. She doesn't know what the hell she's talking about, but she does know how to bully people. And she is a tool to bully and destroy. And so far, she's been very successful.
And I think that sort of legal approach too comes through in Garcetti, which got a couple of mentions. And so it's all the more important to get into handbooks and whatever other language that you can, the language that a number of places, AAUP chapters around the country, both in advocacy places and in collective bargaining settings, have said, no, academic freedom applies to speech about institutional matters. It's not only extramural speech, it's speech about this particular plan, this particular proposal. Big step. Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say I really like your larger framing conception of public education or college education as achieving a greater good, and one of those is reducing inequalities and inequities. I think that's a great way to think about what we're up to in the largest sense. We're trying to figure out how to conduct shared governance more successfully here, so I'm looking for this column. And I agree with you that the key to that is some kind of trust between the two negotiating parties, so faculty and administration. And I think that's more important than trying to get a precise definition of which component of college administration and curriculum each party has jurisdiction over, because that'll never be done clearly, I think. But one of the troubles I think we have here in establishing trust, and I don't know how to get over this, is from our point of view, often the administration isn't transparent in what they're really trying to get, what they're ultimately heading for. So it's very hard to know what to agree with and what not to agree with, and what the real issue on the table is that we're trying to settle. Do you have any helpful suggestions about how you establish trust when it's not clear that the two parties are well-intentioned?
Right, well, so the first point is, and I actually had this conversation with you before the session. For me, it's not, if someone comes to me and says, trust me, you know, I'm well-intentioned, I'm watching my wallet, right? I'm pretty skeptical. I think what's more important is for you to do a couple of things. And one of them is find some things where you can take some baby steps and actually accomplish something together that's workable. You're not going to, in a flashpoint, go from where you are now to trusting your administration in 3 months. And you shouldn't. Right? You should not. What you should do is identify the extent to which you think you can work with people, and identify some small steps. I mean, this is how you establish trust in any relationship. Okay, I'll go this far with you and see how it goes. And then maybe we'll go a little further and we'll see how it goes. But it's sort of, let's not just think that we're going to have trust. And similarly with well-intentions, I'm less concerned at some level with intentions than with what you're actually doing. You could be really well-intentioned and be doing horrible things, right? So the first thing is identify some steps that will, over time, establish some higher levels of confidence that what is being said is what you meant. But the other thing is as a faculty, define yourselves as the folks who can take the pulse of how faculty really feel about a range of issues. And I think one place that does this as well or better than any that I know, and with adjunct faculty, there's a great survey online that New Faculty Majority has that I've seen adjunct faculty use. It has to do with hiring practices and whether you're asked to be hired, you're informed about being hired or not a week or two or a day or two before class, what are your working conditions. But in terms of a general pulse of how faculty feel about the place, about shared governance and the like. Your sort of model is sitting over there quietly in the corner is Irene Mulvey. Fairfield University has, is it an annual survey, you guys?
Chapter does an annual survey.
An annual survey of faculty. And I heard you present once at, I think it was the Institute, where you said the administration at first pretended like they didn't pay attention to it, but we know they were reading it,
Yeah.
right? You want to say a few things?
Well, yeah, it's an annual survey the chapter does, and we put it online, and it shows the trends over a long time. I can send people the link. It's a chapter.
But it's a great survey.
Yeah,
It's an online survey, right?
yeah.
So you become like the expert.
Let's hear it for Gary Rhoades. So, in an ideal world, we would still be wanting to talk about these issues until we all leave at some point. But we need to eat. And if I understand the setup here in Durango, most of the food is downtown. So I propose the following solution. Those of us from out of town, the majority of us are at the Rochester Hotel. And there's a giant brew pub like a block away from the Rochester Hotel. So those of us who are going to eat could all eat at Steamworks, and then we can just stay there and drink and talk about stuff afterwards. So from town, go home for dinner, come back to Steamworks. If you're not from town, eat at Steamworks, and switch tables around so that we can all sort of mix some more. It seems like it's pretty loud in there, but it's also huge. So there's no way you'll have like 30 people at a single table, but there's probably like little hordes of 4 or 5 or 6 all over the place. And then we could just do that until anybody wants to go. So, yes.
One last thing, I want to thank Gary so much for the shout out for our chapter, but I did bring a couple of things that I left at the table near the door. Some handouts on chapter building and building chapters, strengthening chapters, changing chapters. I bought a few buttons and a few mini red
Grab those, but
don't want to take them all.
come on downtown with us. We'll keep the conversation going there, and we won't have to drive back up here in order to do it.
So we're not gonna come back here at 7?
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, it's a huge place. I've been there. Everyone from Durango's been there. It's good. You'll love it. But just after dinner, just start looking around and switching tables. We'll facilitate discussions with one another that way.
What are the crossing expenses?
Oh, good question.
Second, second.
Street and Second Avenue.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes.